The opening page of Esther Perel's book Mating in Captivity includes an epigraph of the poem Wild Things in Captivity by D.H. Lawrence, the last stanza of which is this: "Sex is a state of grace. In a cage it can't take place. Break the cage then, start in and try." And that about sums up the book. No, I guess there's actually a lot more to discuss. So let's start with Esther Perel herself. She's kind of a big deal. Esther Perel is a Belgian-American psychotherapist specializing in relationships and eroticism who has written 2 books, given 2 TED Talks, has 2 podcasts and 2 sons, and is really into the number 2, huh? Mating in Captivity is the first of her 2 books, published in 2006, and has been so popular that it has now been translated into 24 different languages. Esther Perel herself speaks 9 languages, so clearly a bit of an overachiever. The book itself is broken down into chapters, each centering around a different barrier to desire, whether that's parenthood or Puritan shame or democracy, each illustrated by vignettes of previous clients. Names change, of course. I'd like to look at this book in 3 ways: key points, critiques, and takeaways. And each of these has 3 main points themselves. Look at that. Perel has the number 2, I have the number 3. I literally have the number 3 tattooed on me. I'll just lean into it. One of the central dilemmas of achieving and maintaining desire in the context of long-term relationships, which is the focus of this book, is that the qualities that invoke erotic desire are the opposite of the qualities that we understand as meaning love and intimacy. Emotional intimacy, as we understand it in our culture, is, in Perel's opinion, the opposite swing of the pendulum from erotic desire. We seek out and engage in long-term relationships with the goal of creating stability and security and safety and finding someone to act as our other half. But we are not half people, and desire requires a degree of distance, an element of insecurity, an understanding that this other person is not infallible, and neither is our relationship with them. She writes, "Desire is fueled by the unknown, and for that reason it's inherently anxiety-producing. Our willingness to engage that mystery keeps desire alive. Faced with the irrefutable otherness of our partner, we can respond with fear or with curiosity. We can try to reduce the other to a knowable entity, or we can embrace her persistent mystery. When we resist the urge to control, when we keep ourselves open, we preserve the possibility of discovery. Eroticism resides in the ambiguous space between anxiety and fascination." There are other paradoxes we face when it comes to love, sex, intimacy, and desire. We hope for egalitarianism in our day-to-day, equal opportunity for everyone, and yet power dynamics are a key aspect of sexual play. We expect complete honesty from our partners, but then we find out things we either didn't want or need to hear, or we begin to bemoan the lack of mystery. It is natural to seek a semblance of control over our lives, especially in the face of the uncertainty of the world we live in today, and yet there is pleasure and transcendence in the relinquishing of control that often comes with great sex. And the biggest dilemma: we want to love another so badly that we often lose ourselves in the process. A line that really sums up one of the main takeaways that I'll discuss a bit more later is this: loving another without losing ourselves is the central dilemma of intimacy. Does Esther Perel present us then with simple solutions to these problems? No, but can she? It's in the nature of humans to be complicated and contradictory, but when we can acknowledge these contradictory needs and be aware of the ways they may or may not be in balance in our lives, we can begin to pinpoint the direction that the pendulum may need to swing at any given moment in order to create that balance, in order to make the choice for ourselves if and when we want to prioritize eroticism. What Perel is really interrogating within this book are the sexual scripts that we have in place in American culture and the ways in which we can examine these sexual scripts and understand if they are helping or harming us in the context of our relationships. Sexual script theory was coined by sociologist John Gagnon and William Simon in 1973, and it describes the social construction where sexual scripts act as the guidelines for sexual behavior and sexual encounters. Obviously, no one is handed a list of rules the second they start experiencing sexual attraction. That might be helpful in some cases, but the ways we move through society and interact with others are largely constructed through learned behavior. We have a complex system of social rules reinforced through language, symbols, social cues, physical body cues. And sexual scripts are the result of the layering of those guidelines across 3 dimensions: cultural and historical, social and interactive, and personal and intrapsychic. And another major subgenre of social scripting is at play when it comes to the scripts we follow in sexual encounters, and that's gender scripting or gender schema. This regulates what our culture understands as the way boys are versus the way girls are. And yes, gender is much more complicated than boy and girl, and sex is a lot more complicated than boy meets girl. But this is where sexual scripting gets interesting. Cultural historical scripts tend to represent the belief systems of a culture at large, which means that they are subject to bias and prejudice and shitty old-fashioned stereotypes. But sexual scripts, especially at the inter- and intrapersonal levels, aren't set. They can evolve. And being aware of the ways in which they may influence your own behaviors and attitudes can allow you to shift the ways that you are acting out your script. Several common cultural sexual scripts, that's a tongue twister, pop up in the scenes of client experiences that Perel sets up in her book. One client finds unpacking her restrictive upbringing difficult, even within the confines of adulthood and marriage, so reduces herself and her husband to sexual stereotypes. He, sex-obsessed and aggressive, perpetually pursuing her, passive and preferring to talk about her feelings over working them out physically. Another, a young college student, insists that young adults are resisting sexual scripts by engaging only in drunken casual sex, yet are still enacting sexual scripts in that they deny sexual agency in favor of self-denial. The chapters on marriage and motherhood remind us of the Madonna whore complex, where the clients who are new husbands and new fathers are now unable to view their partners as sexual beings who they find desirable, the whore of the Madonna whore complex, because they now view them as above the baseness of sex. The Madonna, this one, not this one, pure, virtuous, nurturing, motherly. The last key point I want to address is, in my opinion, the most overarching and the most important. And it has less to do with like personal desire and romance and more to do with the ways that our interpersonal dynamics reflect the culture at large and the issues within it. As someone who was raised outside of the United States but seems to be quite Americanized in that Esther Perel, lives in New York and her husband is American, and she got her master's in Massachusetts and worked at NYU for 13 years, etc., etc. Esther Perel has an interesting lens through which to see the impact of the American culture of individualism. The ethics of individualism, of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, are baked into the origins of the United States. The roots of America as we know it are based in early explorers, in pioneers, in entrepreneurs, and in all of that colonialism, but I'll touch on that in a second. If you Google the search term American individualism, many of the first search results that come up are actually guides to American culture for immigrants and foreign students. And in that being a point of emphasis, makes it clear how this is a uniquely American perspective that often manifests in a deeply entrenched resistance to feelings of dependency. There is a fine line, though, between staunch independence and isolationism, and especially in the light of global pandemics, the impact of isolation has become glaringly apparent. Perel comments on how individualism and isolation impacts relationships. In our resistance to dependence, we ironically end up becoming hyper-dependent within our relationships. Because we lack diverse community outside of our romantic relationships, whether that's multiple friendship groups, extended family, communities of place like neighborhood social groups, or communities based in shared interest, we tend to expect the same amount of social, emotional, mental, and physical support from one person that we would typically and historically spread across a large swath of people. This is a lot to handle, as Perel points out. She also notes that in this dependence on a singular person, we tend to lose our own sense of self, our identity separate from the relationship, which is fostered by having these communities of our own also separate from our romantic relationship. This leads to enmeshment, a manifestation of codependency where personal boundaries become unclear or permeable. In the same way, we need to balance our needs for stability and excitement, we also need to balance our desire for closeness and the necessity of space. Because ultimately, the opposite of codependency is not hyperindependence, it's interdependence. The recognition that we are individuals, yes, but we are individuals who need each other. No man is an island, and yet every aspect of our culture seems to encourage that mentality to the detriment of our own mental and emotional health. So taking a step back from inter and intrapersonal relationship dynamics, we need to look at the ways that these social scripts, which form our sexual scripts, are a direct result of that colonialist origin of America. Colonialism is a very obvious product of white supremacy. It is white supremacy in action. But some of the other tools of white supremacy are so insidiously embedded in our culture that it can be hard to even recognize them. And yet individualism is tied up so closely in all of them. Individualism asserts an idea that we ourselves are responsible for everything that we do. And in that, everything that is done to us, with no recognition of the ways that systemic oppression affects people across multiple intersections of marginalization. Capitalism is individualism in economic form and perpetuates social inequality through an inequitable distribution of wealth and power. Capitalism actively disintegrates community. Who has time for socializing with friends or having a family when you have to work overtime to pay your rent? How do you meet new people when you don't have the energy to expand your social circle outside of coworkers? When coworkers are your only community, of course you'll stay in an exploitative work environment because you care about the people you work with, and you wouldn't want to abandon them. And if the only job that pays a living wage is on the other side of the state, sorry, I guess we don't get to visit grandma very often anymore. And in an even more Machiavellian 1984 Big Brother take, community creates an environment for nurture, for overcoming differences, for sharing ideas, for creating unity and unions, for finding strength in numbers. community disrupts power structures, and people in power tend to want to stay in power. And the people in power are those same rugged individualists who wrote the structure of our government and economic systems. Okay, off my anti-capitalist soapbox and back to my book review. This book is not without flaws. No piece of media is, except for maybe, Kafka's Metamorphosis, or like the first Shrek movie, maybe. I can give some benefit of the doubt to Esther Perel when it comes to the time period in which this book came about. It was published in 2006, presumably took some time to be written and edited and published, etc., which means that the client observations she's pulling from couldn't be from earlier than the 1990s, and maybe from much earlier than that, depending on when Esther Perel is pulling from within her career experiences. But while there is some diversity in the descriptions of clients, some clients were gay couples, some second-generation immigrants, some interracial couples, very little of that seemed to impact her discussions of their romantic concerns. She was obviously looking at the broad strokes of humanity and human social dynamics, and with a smaller stroke, the nature of American humanity, but there was very little acknowledgement of the impacts of class, race, sexual orientation, age, nationality, and so on the individuals within the clinical vignette. One of the early chapters describes a couple struggling with equal sexual desire. She mentions that they are an interracial couple. They are both musicians. They are both in their early 30s. They have been married 7 years, and they are not having sex. She uses their story to illustrate the ways that care and support can act as a flannel nightgown, as she calls it, on sexual desire. That is, that the safety of their dynamic made it difficult for Candace, one half of this couple, to see her partner as sexually appealing. But what she doesn't consider, at least not on the page, is that Candace, as a young Black woman, may have received entirely different cultural messaging growing up than her partner did. That she may be working off a different sexual script, not unrelated to her race, but because of her race. Were only one of them a musician, I wonder if Perel might bring up the ways that financial inequality can lead to sexual stress, especially when it's tied up in issues of masculinity, which takes me to my second similar critique. Well, as I said, she does briefly touch on having a few gay clients. For the most part, her examples are of cisgender heterosexual clients. And while gender schema is a massive aspect of sexual scripts, it felt like instead of pushing against those gender norms, Perel leaned into them, describing distinctions between female eroticism as being diffuse through the body, not purely genital response. But in calling this a distinctly female eroticism, is that implying an inherent biological experience of eroticism? Does this mean that there is a sex-dependent difference in erotic expression or capability? Where does that then leave transgender and gender diverse people? Is this a gendered eroticism, meaning it is flexible within our cultural understandings of gender, or is it an eroticism based in a biological imperative, which is flawed? As I said, this book was published in 2006 when discourse and research around gender diversity was less prevalent, and Perel herself acknowledges in the introduction that at the time of writing, she did not work with transgender clients. But I did still feel like there could have been a bit more of a push against the ideas of a gender binary within the sexual scripts being interrogated, especially as someone who is placed, whether by herself or maybe by the sexuality research community at large, but has a place towards the forefronts of that intersection between sexual research and media and popular culture. My last critique is actually a critique of a critique, or maybe just an acknowledgement of a critique. I found a book review from The Atlantic published in 2006 when this book initially came out, and in reading their thoughts, I also had some thoughts. The author of this article seems to have some sort of personal beef with Esther Perel. I'm not sure about that, but their main critiques of the book were that Perel's takes were too extreme, that she focused too much on sex, and that she's talking too much about sex. We'll work backwards in unpacking those. It seemed odd to me that their main criticism of a book written by a sex and relationships therapist and written expressly about desire in relationships was that she was talking too much about sex and desire in relationships. It feels like putting on ESPN and then being like, why are there so many sports happening? I don't like sports. I don't know anything about sports, so I don't watch ESPN. Presumably anyone reading this book is reading it because they either are aware of Esther Perel and are curious about her takes, or are experiencing issues in the aspects of desire and eroticism within a long-term relationship. The Atlantic article says, quote, "I am no judge of Perel's practice, but I am a judge of our sexual culture, and it seems to me that we are talking ourselves to death." What I found particularly interesting about this line as a critique was that it directly echoes the third chapter, subtitled, "Talk is not the only avenue to closeness." As for this take from Christina Naring, the author of the Atlantic piece, quote, "It's easy to make fun of this sort of thing, and it's important to do so, for the suggestions Perel offers are repellent, as are the assumptions that underlie them, that sex is our only raison d'etre." That's a undergrad minor in French for you there. "That it's great to forfeit emotional contact for an extra erotic tickle." Naring then goes on to basically undermine everything she's just said by then praising Perel's discussion of the paradoxes of love and intimacy and sex and desire within romantic relationships. But what struck me the most was the apparent conflation within this reading of the book between eroticism and sexual intercourse. The crux of this book is on choosing eroticism, and in that, engaging in and giving agency to oneself as a sexual being. But eroticism is not used in the book as a euphemism for sex. Perel defines eroticism within the book alternately as an immeasurable quality of aliveness and imagination, as pleasure for pleasure's sake, and as sexuality transformed by the imagination. She even explicitly says, you don't even need the act of sex to have a full erotic experience, though sex is often hinted at, envisioned. Eroticism is the cultivation of excitement, a purposeful quest for pleasure. Beyond echoing an overarching cultural dismissal of the vastness of pleasure and sexuality beyond the physical mechanics of intercourse, it kind of feels like Christina Naring didn't actually read the book. Lastly, as it gets increasingly dark in this room, God, I hate winter, I wanted to discuss the things that I am taking away from this book for my own personal life, and that might be applicable to someone watching this. I am not someone who's dealing with fading desire in a 20-year marriage. My longest adult relationship lasted almost a year, and their mother still didn't even know I existed. So clearly not the target audience of this book. But as someone who's open to dating, open to the idea of a committed relationship, there were a few things that I think are really important to keep in mind in my single space and in the early stages of any future romantic endeavors. Firstly, the importance of retaining a sense of self. I was actually ahead of the game on this one in the sense that I was very, very much out of the game. I was falling off the bleachers, but have done a lot of work in therapy in the last couple of years and have learned how important a strong sense of self and a supportive community are, as supported in this book, in even having a healthy outlook on relationships and learning where boundaries were in order to enforce them later. I know that I do not need a romantic partner in order to feel fulfilled in my life, but in that is what allows me to initiate a potential relationships in a way that is fulfilling. I'm also, working through all of that white supremacy and individualistic mindset and capitalist messaging as someone who has both benefited from those systems as well as been harmed by them in various ways, and that kind of gives you a good idea of who you are. The next takeaway is not from a portion of the book that I have discussed anywhere else in this video, but it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. Chapter 10, titled The Shadow of the Third, Rethinking Fidelity. This book has great chapter titles, just read it for that alone. But chapter 10 discusses the concepts of monogamy, jealousy, and infidelity, which I think her second book is actually all about, but I haven't read it yet, so can't tell you that for sure. In this chapter, Perel notes that because monogamy is assumed as a default, it is something that we fail to negotiate in our committed relationships. The problem in this, as it applies to me, is in the ways that by assuming monogamy means the same thing to ourselves as to anyone else, we're setting ourselves up for being hurt and hurting someone else. I mean, look at any Am I the Asshole Reddit thread around cheating, and you'll find hundreds of different definitions of what it means to cheat, meaning every single one of those persons has a different understanding of what monogamy means. While polyamory is still considered like out of the box or strange, polyamory, or ethical non-monogamy, requires negotiations of boundaries in a way that we don't with monogamy. Beyond, are we exclusive? Yes or no? My final takeaway, and the one I will end this video with, is the importance of prioritizing pleasure. Many people do not have the same sexual freedoms that I have, and that is not something to ever be taken for granted. And while pleasure should not be relegated as an imperative to feel like an obligation or an extra line on that constantly increasing to-do list, we can make the choice to foster and encourage and allow ourselves to experience pleasure when those opportunities present themselves to us. Whether that's drinking a coffee in the sun on the first warm day of the year, or having porno-level sex marathons with the love of your life. Fingers crossed for either of those, honestly. If you'd like to read Mating in Captivity yourself, I recommend it. I'd like to hear thoughts from anyone else who has read the book, but I have linked its listing on the bookshop.org page, which is an online shop that supports independent bookstores, sources from independent bookstores. So, great choice for buying books online. Anyway, thank you for watching. Bye.